The crusher loomed in the cold vacuum of space, a monolithic machine built by the finest engineers the galaxy had to offer. Its sole purpose: to obliterate rogue planets that threatened the stability of the galactic empire. For years, it had done its job flawlessly, leaving nothing but dust in its wake. Now, though, something had gone horribly wrong. The massive engines that powered the machine had started to malfunction. Systems were failing one by one, and the heart of the crusher, its core reactor, was on the brink of a catastrophic meltdown. Inside, chaos reigned. Alien engineers of every species scrambled in panic, their voices overlapping in frantic commands. No one could stop the disaster. The station was in disarray, alarms blaring as entire sections were sealed off by emergency protocols. The elites, who had always considered themselves superior in technology, knowledge, and intellect, saw no other option but to flee. The failure was too great, the risks too high, and the time too short. Escape pods shot out of the station like fireworks, carrying away the alien crew, their dignitaries, and their command officers. They didn't care about the crusher anymore. It was deemed a lost cause. And Earth? A distant afterthought to most of them. The aliens had always seen humans as a species barely worth acknowledging, a necessary but unremarkable presence in the galactic order. In their minds, no human could possibly have the skill or the intelligence to salvage a disaster of this magnitude. But aboard the crusher, a handful of human engineers remained. Left behind in the evacuation, they were a small, seemingly insignificant team. Most of the time, they had been relegated to menial maintenance tasks while the alien crew handled what they referred to as real engineering. Yet, these humans weren't the type to surrender to chaos. They saw the situation for what it truly was, not just a mechanical failure, but a threat that could ripple across multiple systems. The crusher, if it went down, wouldn't just destroy itself, it could take countless inhabited planets with it, including Earth. The moment of truth had arrived, and while the aliens abandoned ship, the humans made a different decision. They weren't going anywhere. Gathered in a cramped control room lit by the dim glow of failing monitors, the humans quickly assessed the situation. They had little time to act. Power was fluctuating, the core reactor was dangerously unstable, and defense systems were starting to come online in erratic bursts, targeting anything that moved. No one had to say it out loud, but the weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air. The odds were stacked against them. No one had ever expected them to be the heroes of the story, least of all the aliens. But that didn't matter now. They were human. And that meant, no matter how grim things looked, they were going to fight for a solution. Not for recognition, not for some alien council, but because they knew it was the right thing to do. Earth, their home, depended on them. A quick check of the control systems revealed the extent of the damage. The core reactor was nearing critical failure. If it wasn't stabilized soon, the crusher would implode, triggering a shockwave that would take out everything in a wide radius. The team split into smaller groups, each engineer taking responsibility for a specific system. They needed to work quickly and in perfect sync, or everything would be lost. There wasn't time for hesitation. With tools in hand, they scattered to different parts of the crusher. One engineer headed to the reactor core, ready to manually regulate the power flow. Another rushed to the mainframe to bypass the failing systems, hoping to reroute what little power remained into stabilizing the ship's vital components. The rest were tasked with handling the defense systems, trying to override them before they went completely rogue. They moved like clockwork, each trusting the other to do their part. It was an unspoken understanding, no grand speeches or declarations of bravery, just a quiet resolve. This was what humans excelled at, finding solutions in the face of impossible odds. It didn't matter if they weren't the galaxy's top engineers. What mattered was that they weren't going to let the crusher's destruction happen on their watch. Time was slipping away faster than they could manage, but the team wasn't giving up. As the station groaned under the pressure, parts of the hull began to buckle. The temperature in the reactor room was rising, a dangerous sign that the core was close to overheating. The engineer stationed there had only minutes to get the cooling systems back online. His hands moved with precision, rewiring circuits that hadn't been touched in years, bypassing safety protocols that no alien would dare touch. The sweat dripped from his forehead, but he kept his focus, knowing one wrong move could seal their fate. Elsewhere, the others were making their own progress. The mainframe operator managed to reroute enough power to keep essential systems functioning. Lights flickered back to life in sections that had been plunged into darkness. It wasn't much, but it bought them precious time. The others worked on disarming the defense systems, one by one. Turrets that had once been on the verge of targeting them went silent. Automated drones, which had hovered ominously, shut down mid-flight. Still, the situation was dire. The core was their biggest challenge, and it was still moments away from a catastrophic failure. But the team wasn't finished yet. Together, they had brought the Crusher back from the edge of complete destruction, but now came the most critical task. They weren't just fixing a machine anymore, they were saving entire planets, including their own. And they weren't about to let the arrogance of alien engineers or the impossible odds stop them. The humans moved quickly through the vast, failing station, each step filled with purpose. They didn't have the luxury of time. There was no room for second-guessing, no space for doubt. Every second that passed, the Crusher edged closer to a catastrophic meltdown. It wasn't just their lives on the line, it was entire planetary systems, including their home. That reality settled heavily on their shoulders, but it also drove them forward. They weren't about to let everything fall apart. Each engineer knew their role. No speeches were made, no pep talks exchanged. They had trained for moments like these, and now they relied on their instincts, skills, and the bond they shared as a team. They were used to working under pressure, even if nothing quite compared to the ticking time bomb that was the Crusher. Down near the reactor, one of the engineers worked furiously. His hands flew over the control panel, trying to stabilize the core's temperature before it reached critical. Sweat dripped from his face, and the heat in the room was rising by the second. The reactor, a towering behemoth of alien technology, groaned as if in protest to his efforts. The systems were old, patched together from generations of alien upgrades that didn't always fit neatly with each other. This wasn't a simple repair job, it was a battle to keep the machine from tearing itself apart. Nearby, another engineer was working on restoring the cooling systems. Without them, the reactor would overheat and trigger a chain reaction that would make the station go up in flames. She worked quickly, rerouting power from non-essential systems, cutting off energy to parts of the Crusher that had already been abandoned by the fleeing aliens. Every circuit she manipulated, every wire she patched, had to be done with precision. One wrong move, and she could overload the whole system, making the situation worse. But she kept her cool, her focus unshaken by the mounting pressure. Meanwhile, the team handling the defense systems faced their own challenges. The automated defenses, designed by the best minds of the Galactic Empire, were coming online in unpredictable patterns. The Crusher, in its malfunctioning state, was treating the human engineers as threats, targeting them with everything from energy turrets to security drones. The alien systems didn't differentiate between friend and foe. They only knew how to defend the ship against perceived intruders. The humans didn't have advanced alien weapons or shields. All they had were their tools, their wits, and a relentless determination not to let the Crusher win. They'd seen worse odds before, and each of them had faced personal challenges that had prepared them for moments like this. It wasn't about what tools they lacked, it was about what they could do with what they had. Using every trick they knew, they hacked into the defense systems, working to disable them one by one. The process wasn't easy. The alien code was foreign, complex, and constantly shifting as the Crusher's failing systems tried to compensate for the malfunctions. But humans had always been good at adapting, at learning on the fly. They worked quickly, finding patterns in the code, exploiting weaknesses in the alien programming. One by one, the turrets went silent. The drones, once a deadly threat, dropped to the ground as their circuits were overloaded. The battle with the Crusher's defenses wasn't over, though. As soon as they disabled one system, another sprang to life. The team worked tirelessly, hands never stopping, eyes never leaving their tasks. They communicated with each other through quick, terse words, updates given in rapid bursts as they handled the chaos around them. Every now and then, one of them would let out a relieved breath when they managed to shut down another hostile system. But there was no time to rest, no time to let their guard down. They knew that even a moment's hesitation could mean failure. While the defense systems were being handled, the engineers tasked with the core continued their fight against time. The reactor was still dangerously unstable, and the cooling systems were struggling to keep up with the rising heat. The temperature was close to reaching the red zone, the point of no return. But the human engineers didn't back down. They had been in situations like this before, albeit on a smaller scale, and they knew that the key was to stay calm, to focus on the solution rather than the problem. Working in near unison, they rerouted more power, patched failing systems, and manipulated controls with the precision of seasoned experts. Their hands moved swiftly, bypassing safety protocols that the alien engineers wouldn't have dared touch. The system had been designed to prevent unauthorized access, but humans had a knack for breaking through barriers, both literal and figurative. The engineer in charge of stabilizing the reactor monitored the temperature closely, adjusting the settings in real time. He could feel the heat pressing down on him, but he didn't let it slow him down. His fingers tapped out commands on the console, initiating cooling sequences and diverting excess energy to prevent overloads. Every few moments, a new warning light flashed on the screen, but he didn't let it distract him. He stayed focused, knowing that if they could just hold on a little longer, they could prevent the core from reaching critical mass. The rest of the team worked in tandem, making sure that the systems supporting the reactor stayed functional. They had managed to pull some power from the failing parts of the crusher, just enough to keep the core from melting down completely. But it wasn't a permanent fix. They were still on borrowed time, and they knew it. The crusher was too far gone to be fully repaired, but their job wasn't to save the entire station, it was to stop it from blowing up. Each member of the team was hyper-focused, their minds locked in on the task at hand. They were running on adrenaline, on the knowledge that their lives, and the lives of countless others, depended on their success. Failure wasn't an option. The aliens might have abandoned the crusher, but the humans weren't going to let it destroy everything. As they worked, the tension in the air was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity. But slowly, they began to see the results of their efforts. The reactor's temperature stabilized, if only for a moment. The warning alarms went silent, and the power grid flickered back to life in critical areas. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to buy them time. Enough to keep the crusher from tearing itself apart long enough for them to come up with a more permanent solution. They had done it. For now, they had bought themselves a sliver of hope. The core was no longer on the verge of destruction, and the defense systems were no longer actively trying to kill them. But they weren't out of the woods yet. The crusher was still dangerously unstable, and they had a long way to go before they could truly say they had saved it. The humans, though temporarily relieved by the stabilization of the reactor, knew this was just a small victory. The core may not be on the brink of exploding anymore, but the crusher's systems were still in chaos. Its colossal size meant that problems in one area could cascade into others, and they had to act fast to prevent a chain reaction. They hadn't just stabilized the core, they bought themselves a narrow window of time. The next step was crucial, getting control over the station's remaining vital systems, most importantly navigation and propulsion, to keep the crusher from drifting into a populated system. One of the engineers, stationed near the navigation hub, quickly realized they weren't out of danger yet. The station's automated systems had started recalculating the crusher's trajectory. They were close to entering the gravitational pull of a nearby planet. If the crusher continued on this path, it would either crash or be pulled into orbit, where it would eventually break apart, sending deadly debris everywhere. Worse yet, any impact with a planet would likely activate the crusher's failsafes, triggering its destructive capabilities, meaning total planetary annihilation. The team knew they had to act quickly to override the system and steer the crusher away from the planet. But there was a problem. The navigation system had locked them out. It had initiated emergency protocols that could only be bypassed by authorized personnel, and with the alien engineers gone, there were no credentials available. The humans were faced with an impossible situation, forced to hack into a system that was never meant for them to control. Undeterred, the team got to work. Hacking alien systems wasn't new to them. Over the years, humans had become adept at breaking through the barriers set by more advanced species. They didn't have the fancy equipment or the intricate knowledge of alien tech, but they had ingenuity and persistence. They began by analyzing the system's security layers, looking for any weaknesses they could exploit. The pressure was mounting. They had minutes, maybe less, before the crusher's trajectory became irreversible. One of the engineers, working furiously at a console, discovered an old access point that hadn't been properly secured during an earlier system update. It wasn't much, but it was their best shot. With a combination of quick thinking and sheer determination, they managed to bypass the first few layers of security. But it wasn't enough. The navigation system's emergency protocol was still intact, preventing them from fully accessing the controls. The tension was rising. The team could feel the crusher pulling closer to the planet, its massive bulk slowly succumbing to the gravitational pull. They were running out of options. Then, an idea struck one of the engineers. Instead of trying to control the navigation system directly, they could manipulate the propulsion system to create a small thrust, just enough to nudge the crusher off its current path. It wouldn't solve the long-term problem, but it could buy them more time. It was risky. If they applied too much thrust, they could send the crusher into a spin, making things even worse. But at this point, it was their only chance. The team quickly shifted their focus to the propulsion systems. They worked in silence, each one of them focused entirely on the task at hand. Sweat dripped down their faces, but their hands moved with precision. They rerouted power from non-essential systems and calibrated the thrust engines manually. The crusher was an old machine, and its propulsion systems weren't as reliable as they had once been. But the humans didn't need them to be perfect, they just needed them to work long enough to change their course. The engines fired. A low rumble echoed through the station as the crusher's massive thrusters came to life. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the station began to shift. The gravitational pull of the nearby planet was still strong, but the thrust was just enough to push them away from the point of no return. The humans watched the monitors with bated breath as the trajectory shifted, inch by inch, until the crusher was no longer on a direct collision course with the planet. Relief washed over the team, but it was short-lived. The thrusters, never meant to be fired in such a state of disrepair, quickly overheated. Warning lights flared across the consoles. The team scrambled to shut them down before the engines exploded, but it was too late. A small explosion rocked the rear of the station, sending a shockwave through the halls. The humans braced themselves as the station shuddered, alarms blaring once more. The damage, while not catastrophic, was significant. They had lost control of the propulsion system. The crusher was now drifting in space, no longer on a collision course but still dangerously close to the planet's gravity well. Without propulsion, they were at the mercy of the station's momentum. With the propulsion system offline, they had no way of steering the station or controlling its speed. Worse yet, the explosion had caused damage to the structural integrity of the station. Several sections had been compromised, and the pressure was dropping in key areas. The humans had no choice but to seal off parts of the station to prevent further damage. But with every section they sealed, their options grew fewer. They were being boxed in by the very machine they were trying to save. Despite the setbacks, the team didn't lose hope. They knew the situation was dire, but they had already overcome impossible odds just to get this far. They couldn't afford to think about the bigger picture right now. All they could do was focus on the next step. The next challenge. The core was stable. The immediate threat of a planetary collision had been averted. But now they faced a new problem. Without propulsion, they were adrift in space, with no way of controlling their path or speed. They couldn't rely on external help. The alien engineers were long gone, and there was no chance of rescue. They were on their own. And yet, that was exactly what gave them the edge. The aliens had fled, convinced that the crusher was beyond saving. They had underestimated the humans, dismissed them as insignificant. But the humans hadn't given up. They were still fighting, still finding ways to survive. And that made all the difference. As the team regrouped, they knew they were far from out of danger. The Crusher was a dying machine, and they were running out of time. But they had proven, once again, that they could think on their feet, adapt to impossible situations, and find solutions where others saw only failure. They weren't done yet. The Crusher drifted, the once powerful machine now a silent, wounded giant. The human engineers gathered in the control room, surrounded by flickering monitors and damaged consoles. They were exhausted, physically and mentally, but they couldn't stop yet. The station wasn't going to stabilize itself. There were still systems failing, sections of the ship collapsing in on themselves. Time was running out. But they had survived so far, and that was no small thing. Against all odds, they had kept the core from melting down, prevented a collision with a nearby planet, and fought off both hostile defense systems and the ship's own breakdown. They had come too far to give up now. The next priority was the station's life support systems. The explosion from the thrusters had caused serious damage to the infrastructure, and now oxygen levels were dropping. Some of the lower decks had already become uninhabitable, and without immediate intervention, the rest of the station would soon follow. The engineers understood the gravity of the situation. Without life support, their efforts would be for nothing. Despite the growing exhaustion, they divided the remaining tasks among themselves. The path to the life support control center was blocked by collapsed sections of the station, meaning they need to find alternate routes. With only a limited amount of time and air, each movement had to be precise. They weren't just racing against the system anymore. They were racing against their own body's need for oxygen. One of the engineers took the lead, finding an access route through the station's maintenance shafts. The others followed, the narrow passages forcing them to crawl through debris and unstable sections of the ship. Every step was a reminder of how close they were to losing everything they'd worked for. The sound of their breathing, growing more labored with each passing minute, filled the confined space as they pushed forward, knowing that failure was not an option. Finally, they reached the life support hub. The station's ventilation systems had been damaged during the explosion, and several key circuits had shorted out. The controls were locked behind layers of malfunctioning alien security protocols, the systems responding unpredictably to the overloads. The humans didn't have the luxury of time to carefully work through the protocols, so they opted for brute force, disconnecting faulty circuits and hardwiring manual control overrides. It was a crude solution, but it was the only one available. Their hands moved quickly, each second bringing them closer to either success or suffocation. The atmosphere inside the station was thin, the cold air making their lungs ache. They could feel themselves slowing down, but none of them gave up. Piece by piece, they restored the ventilation systems, hearing the rush of fresh air filling the decks. Oxygen flowed back into the station, and the pressure inside the control room began to stabilize. It was a victory, but not a full one. They had bought themselves time, but not much. The structural integrity of the station was still compromised. The damage from the explosion had destabilized the core reactor once again, and without a functioning propulsion system, they had no control over where the Crusher was heading. They were drifting, their fate in the hands of the cold expanse of space. But humans didn't wait for fate to decide their future. One of the engineers had an idea. If they couldn't fix the propulsion system, they could at least guide the station using its remaining energy reserves. It wasn't a solution any of the aliens would have thought of. It required a level of improvisation and risk that most species found unthinkable. But for the humans, it was a last-ditch effort worth taking. The plan was simple: use the station's auxiliary power to reroute energy into the docking thrusters, small systems normally used for fine-tuning the station's position when docking with other ships. It wouldn't give them full control, but it could allow them to adjust the station's course just enough to avoid major obstacles and potentially steer towards safer territory. The team moved quickly, each engineer knowing exactly what they needed to do. They accessed the power grid, diverting all non-essential systems into the thrusters. Lights dimmed throughout the station, and the hum of machinery quieted as power was concentrated into one final push. The engineers coordinated their efforts, working together to manually control the thrusters. The Crusher groaned as the thrusters fired. The movement was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually, the station began to shift. It was working. The humans guided the crusher, adjusting its course away from the gravitational pull of nearby celestial bodies. It wasn't a perfect solution, they were still adrift, but they had avoided the immediate danger of drifting into a planet or asteroid field. As the station settled into a new trajectory, the engineers took a moment to catch their breath. For the first time in what felt like hours, they allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. They had done everything they could. They had saved the station from certain destruction, prevented a massive loss of life, and proved that humans could survive, even when everyone else had given up. But the crusher was still a dying machine. The damage was too extensive to fully repair, and the station's systems were far too compromised to make it functional again. They had stabilized it, but it wasn't enough to keep it operational for the long term. Eventually, it would break down completely. That was inevitable. Yet, the humans didn't see this as a failure. They had accomplished what the aliens couldn't. They had shown that even when faced with overwhelming odds, they could survive, adapt, and find a way through. And that mattered. They had bought time for themselves, time for the planets nearby, time for Earth. As they looked out at the stars, watching the distant galaxies stretch across the horizon, they knew that they hadn't just saved the crusher. They had saved a piece of humanity's future. It wasn't the grand, heroic tale that the aliens would write about in their history books, but it didn't need to be. The humans knew what they had achieved. That was enough. The station, damaged and barely holding together, floated silently through space. It was no longer the powerful machine it had once been, no longer the indestructible weapon designed by the galaxy's most advanced species. But in its final moments, it had been saved by those who had been overlooked, underestimated, and left behind. The humans had done what no one else could. They had survived. As the engineers settled back, knowing they had done all they could, a sense of quiet accomplishment filled the room. They had faced the impossible, and they had won.